Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. To highlight the pitfalls and duties of fiduciaries when acquiring, gifting, and disposing of art and antiquities, we are thrilled to have Charles Cochrane of Cochrane Adams Fine Art Agents, Rebecca Lockwood of Sotheby's, and Alyssa Quinlan from Hindman Auctions. And joining them are my partners, Kristen Douglas from our New York office and Nick Holland from our London office. And unfortunately, Jenny Johnson-Ware from our Chicago office had a client emergency and will not be able to join us today. If you have questions, they can be submitted through the Q&A function and will be answered as time permits, most likely at the end of the presentation. Okay, so diving into our program, we're going to start with Kristen. And Kristen's going to tell us how market uncertainty and volatility has affected the art world.
Yeah, so welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. Jumping right into it, I think it goes without saying, and we're all probably a little sick of hearing it, but this is an unprecedented and challenging time for almost every industry, and that includes the art industry. So I thought it would be helpful maybe to just start this off with asking our guest speakers to just share some of their observations as to how these circumstances have affected the art industry. So maybe Alyssa, do you want to kick it off?
Sure, absolutely. Hello, everyone. I would really say that the first signs of the pandemic we began to see in January. We have an Asian Works of Art sale that's typically held in March, that is in conjunction with Asia Week in New York. And we were starting to get calls from our clients letting us know that they were not going to be able to come to town for those sales. And that's something that they have always done in the past. It started with maybe 1 or 2 calls and then quickly started escalating from there. So we realized as they were starting to mention coronavirus, which was something that nobody had really been familiar with at that time, it was a much bigger deal abroad. And as we all know, it is now impacting us so greatly. So we ended up having to push back those sales, and in the auction industry, that is a very big deal. You really do not ever push back auctions. So we did that with the Asian Works of Art sales, the fine jewelry sales, and then fine art sales as well. But we were able to move forward with our regularly scheduled, some of the more conservative priced items in April. What was positive with this was that we had been holding our auctions online. So all of our auctions that we hold about 130 sales a year annually, and each of them are listed on different internet platforms. So the transition for us was somewhat smooth, relatively speaking. Had this happened 10 years ago, it would have been a much different impact. So we were able to essentially just move everything to these online sales. We conducted the sales by Zoom. Everybody was at home, and we were conducting telephone bids, absentee bids, et cetera, on behalf of the clients. The only difference was that they weren't able to go in-house. Forbes actually recognized the industry as being pandemic proof because unlike the art fairs and others, the auction world was able to move forward with sales. We have found that supply is definitely down, but the demand is very high. Our sell-through rates are higher than they have been ever. We are averaging about 92% sell-through rates, and the prices realized have gone up across all categories that we sell. So generally speaking, things are very strong. We have clients are home, they're wanting to decorate their homes, they're not traveling as much. I had one client that reached out and said, I'm not going to Europe this year, and I want you to find me a 10-carat diamond. So it ranges from jewelry and fine art and many different things, but we're seeing younger buyers, and just generally speaking, there's a lot of demand right now in auctions.
Great. Rebecca, do you have any additional input on that?
Sure. So, looking back to when the pandemic first hit New York, and we were seeing signs of it in even January and February and March, I don't think anybody would have really predicted that the art market would be flourishing in October and even as early as June. But as Alyssa points out, I think all the major auction houses and galleries were forced really to take a giant leap into the 21st century. And despite these being really ancient business models at their core, we were all able to reposition ourselves as high-tech online marketplaces. So the pivot for us happened almost immediately because of large investments in tech and investments we've made over the past few years, thanks to our leadership. So our online sales, our live format sales were converted almost immediately in March. And there were only really minor disruptions, frankly, to the very seasonal structured sale calendar. So the largest of which was obviously our Impressionist, Modern, and Contemporary major spring sales, which were pushed from May to June. But we were actually able to really seamlessly convert regularly scheduled live sales to this, I think, more appealing to a lot of current buyers, timed online only sales. So to date, our online sales in 2020 have totaled more than 300 million. And to put that in context, it's more than 3 times our full year's worth of sales online in 2019. So we're just now in the midst of our major fall sales season. So we're on track to do much, much more. So I think it's important to note, one, that's not just online sales that are in an accessible price point, meaning objects under $1 million, accessible as relative speaking. But even this spring we had a Francis Bacon sell to an online bidder in Asia for $85 million. So that's obviously an exception to the rule, but generally speaking, the object's average value are significantly lower than that. What I also want to stress is that it's not just about a change in the sale platform, but it's also about the way that people are buying and adapting their habits as collectors to how they view and experience and enjoy art. And we've been forced to really enhance the ways that clients can experience and interact with art through their computer screens, their telephone screens, their iPad screens. So it's obviously difficult to simulate that firsthand experience with a screen when you're wanting to see and fall in love with a work of art and feel passionately about purchasing it. But we've interestingly relied increasingly on cutting edge tech like augmented reality, which allows you to actually project a work of art onto your wall and envision it at home, what it might look like. Also allowing you to virtually navigate through our galleries, which we're still mounting in a museum exhibition quality space. So I think it's important to note that we've had to invest not just in these sales platforms, but also all the sort of bells and whistles that help to persuade buyers to purchase works. And that's even the catalog. I think when you think of a traditional auction catalog, you think of a rather dense, lovely, lavish publication you might display on your coffee table. But now that everything's online and digital, opportunities are endless. We can put video content and interviews and editorial, a lot more sort of dense, interesting content for folks to enjoy and experience differently now.
Yeah, that's great. Charles, what effects have you noticed in the UK art world?
Well, I mean, very similar, clearly. I mean, I guess for the art market, which is a visual market, and I should say, I'm, in case people aren't aware, I'm not an auction house and I'm not a dealer, I'm an agent. And so I'm looking at this very much as an independent. I think the things that were happening in London were very much the same as in New York. And viewing, we're in a visual business, and viewing was very, very difficult. And what I think is amazing is what had already been online sales. So classically things like multiples or jewelry, which I think already was quite well established, particularly at the lower end, that got morphed so quickly to everything. And people were, I think, happy at least to be interested in looking online only. And if you look at the Bacon, as you said, at Sotheby's, that was $84.5 million spent on something that I don't think the buyer had actually seen. And that is incredible. I mean, we talk about this as though it's a calm, normal, evolutionary process. This really isn't, and people are spending so much money on things they haven't seen. And I think if you want a sort of independent response, my feeling is that there's a feeling that trends in the art market have been magnified through online. So my feeling is that the best of best sales is something that's going to happen more and more and more. You'll have more traditional categories will start forming blockbuster sales of perhaps slightly conservatively set objects, but objects that can be understood easily. And so I think one of the things I'm interested in is going to be how unusual objects are still going to find their way into the auction houses. And particularly without very low and very attractive estimates, because that's what I think is happening for the timed online sales. You can drop down and be quite an interesting object and find yourself in a timed sale with not so much marketing, and I think that's changed quite a lot. Although there's large numbers the amount of time to get to know something is much shorter. And it'll be interesting to see how that translates into, and I think I can't remember, one of the two earlier speakers were talking about how you fall in love with a work of art when you only see it on screen, because you're actually falling in love with the screen, and that's just not the same sort of psychological interest. So I'm going to be very interested to see how the auction houses bring back the theatre of bidding, which is such a big thing for stimulating interest. And perhaps over the summer, that was, I think the sales felt a bit flatter than if they had been a terrestrial format.
Right. And adding on to this topic of this surge in online auctions, and auctions being obviously the most convenient way during this situation to sell a piece, are there situations where, especially maybe from a fiduciary perspective, where you have this heightened obligation in managing the disposition of the piece for your beneficiaries, are there situations in which you guys find that a private sale is a much more appropriate option than selling a piece at auction?
Who would you like to go first?
I'm going to let you guys govern yourselves now. Whoever wants to jump in.
I mean, I have just been speaking, so maybe I should, if I just carry on, you can pick me off on some things I say. But I mean, there's always, I think, a decision to be made between a private sale, which carries less risk than an auction sale, to put it bluntly. You start at the upper end of expectations, as opposed to auction, where you start at the low end and you let the market bid up to what you hope to sell at. I think those decisions for a fiduciary or anyone owning a work of art, what you want to do is know all of that before you commit to something, and that's quite a hard thing to do in the art world. It is just difficult, and to feel that you've got a really good idea for the reward, that the upper end that you could get to with as little risk as possible. And I think going back to the online and the COVID pandemic is one thing that was interesting about the private market is that continued pretty much unaltered throughout the auction period, that then had to have this incredible development into going purely online. And I can't imagine any of the auction houses going back to having traditional format auctions. Maybe I'll be proved wrong, and maybe one of you will tell me that's just not, you will be doing that. But I think people have embraced that now. But the private market is going on now as it was, and even back in February and March, where you can be much more you can be totally bespoke about what you're doing. Mm-hmm. Viewing, however, is the difficulty. That is your difficulty.
Right. Rebecca, I think you had an interesting example of this, which is public knowledge, so I think we can talk about it. But I think Ron Perlman's collection, this issue came up in deciding private sale versus auction. Could you talk a little bit about that, maybe?
Sure. And I think that's one of two excellent examples to point to. One, I think, better illustrates maybe the fiduciary elements, which is the estate of Donald Marin. And this was an estate that was sold earlier this year, actually, made headlines because of the appealing sort of aspect of a private sale that the family was drawn toward. It was the first time really that a consortium of major dealers competed against the major auction houses for a substantial consignment from an estate. We're talking in excess of $400 million in total for the Marin collection. And they were, I guess, attractive in that instance, not so much about achieving the highest possible result potentially, but because they were interested in doing something a little bit more discreet, interested in doing something that was less the sensation that creating a blockbuster single owner sale at one of the houses is really about. And it was a consortium that had never been formed before between Pace, Gagosian, and Aquavella Galleries, who together pitched to sell the collection privately over a period of months. So that was, an unprecedented selection by a family to take that route. We've now understood that group is now planning to remain a sort of informal associated or consortium of dealers, and perhaps make pitches for such collections again going into the future. So the auction houses are needing to respond to that, certainly, and provide a counterpoint to it. One point of caution I'll draw from this is if you are approaching as a fiduciary different outlets for sale, exploring auction versus private sale, the worst thing that you can possibly do is shop the collection too much and call that burned in the auction market. And certainly what's most exciting, particularly coming from the trusted estates point of view, is when something comes to the market for the first time in decades, and it creates a huge splash because it's been tucked away for decades, and you get to reintroduce it to the market, and everybody's just vying for a chance to buy a piece of it. You see this in all the major estate names that have come to market in the last 10, 20, 30 years. So the more that you perhaps engage in quiet conversations before an auction, attempting to persuade folks to make private sale offers, you endanger it a bit by losing some of that sparkle and shine that you get from that initial splash introduction at auction. And to speak about separately, Ron Perlman, that's a different situation. It's a bit tricky, obviously. It's been widely reported that Sotheby's is selling a number of important works from Mr. Perlman's collection. He's gone on the record as currently downsizing. So it's known in the press that a number of these works are being offered through auction, as well as for private sale, as well as by some of our competitors. And Ron sort of broken it up in that way. So in pursuing the sort of hybrid private sale auction option for sales, we've really evaluated what's the best course for each type of work we're dealing with. And for those of you who may have seen this just in the press yesterday, Bloomberg reported on a work that we are selling, a major documented standing figure, which we're conducting a very rare type of sales strategy. It's a sealed private bid sale. So interested buyers are going to be required to submit a confidential bid for the work. It's reported to sell in excess of 90 million. That's the minimum starting bid. And as the sale closes, Sotheby's general counsel and independent auditors are going to review the irrevocable bids, and the highest bidder will ultimately win the work. So this is highly atypical, but I think it demonstrates that we're trying to respond to the demands of our clients and come up with some creative solutions that don't fit squarely within the traditional auction format or the private sale format, particularly when it comes to these sort of ultra valuable works of art. Bear in mind the record for a work by Giacometti is 100 million. So when you're reaching that price point, I think you'll start to see some new types of strategies like this emerge more and more.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And I think, Alyssa, from our prior conversations, you had some helpful takeaways just as far as general considerations to keep in mind when you're deciding between private sale versus auction. Do you want to?
Definitely echo, Charles and Rebecca and their comments. Additionally, I think we have seen a certain increase with clients that want to sell privately right now. I think to the points Charles made just about wanting to move things forward and not have the unknown. Obviously, we are firm believers in the process, but there are times where private sales do make sense. And in those situations, oftentimes because auction records are public, that is one deterrent for clients. They either don't want to sell through public auction to let people know what they're selling. And then in terms of buyers, we do have clients that will come to us and say, I do not want something that's hanging on my wall. If somebody comes in, they could, look online at the auction site and find those prices realized, or there are databases such as ArtNet that are available for a fee, but you can go in and essentially find out what people paid for works of art. So there's that anonymity factor to it that private sales is attractive to some. And additionally, sometimes you'll have dealers that are willing to pay more because they might have an end buyer that is willing to pay more, and they like to stay off record, if you will, by purchasing things at auction. So those are just a few other examples that we're seeing recently in terms of some of the increased demand for private sales versus auction.
Yeah.
For a second, Kristen. Sorry, just a moment. Over here in the UK, there's been an awful lot of talk about distressed corporate sales in the news recently. And I wonder, I'm not sure if the same phenomenon has been taking place in the US as well, and to what extent, if you're aware, they've been using private versus public auction for the sales of those sorts of collections or pieces. Sometimes it's just individual pieces.
Just to jump in quickly on that, we've handled 6 corporate art collections this summer already. There's been a huge increase in basically corporations that are looking to sell works of art that maybe they're not using. It came through mergers and acquisitions in several of the instances that we're working with these clients. Typically in the past, they use that use of name as a good selling point. Now we're finding that they don't want their names associated with it. but it is a means typically so that they don't have to let people go. They're selling some works of art so that they can keep lights on and all of that. But we are finding that the that use of name is not typically attached to the corporate collections as they had been in the past.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt. So I think just to make sure we hit all our topics here, we should move on to our next topic, and that's gifting art. Unless anyone has anything more to add on the selling of art.
Well, I think just one last point that we will quickly make, I promise, Nicole, on the selling point is that with the quarantine situation, it seems like it has had a really significant effect, especially on smaller galleries. And some of these smaller galleries that may be facing insolvency, there have been a number of issues that come up potentially for our clients who are working with these smaller galleries. So just the cautionary tale of the Paddle 8 case. And our key takeaways, just to rush to the end of that topic, is basically if you are giving a piece on consignment to a gallery or to an auction house, but it's even of more concern with a smaller gallery, just try and make it as clear as possible that that piece is on consignment, it's not inventory, and insist to the extent possible on a segregated account for your piece. So, okay. And then with that, we will move on, Nicole, to gifting art.
Well, I think, can I just say that I think maybe we should explore that just a little bit longer, because I think one of the things we do want to talk about, because it does go into the next bit as well, which is how are we, how are people holding the art, and some of the ambiguities in terms of the way in which museums are holding pieces and art galleries are. And it's amazing, I think, how not documented some of these things are, particularly pieces that have been on collection for a long time. I wonder if any of you have anything you'd like to say about that particular issue.
Well, I mean, I can say from Britain, there are clients who had large landed estates and have lost their houses through taxation. And one of the things they had were papers that went back hundreds of years and are now incredibly valuable, but they didn't have anywhere to store them. So the traditional approach was to put them into the local county or state galleries and museums, and of course no one documented them, and now they're worth a lot of money, and they are having litigation over whether this was a gift or a loan, and it's as simple as that, and it's fascinating, and at the time they were just not considered important, and of course 30-40 years later they are. And I guess what one needs, I mean, the trouble is you need lawyers, you need someone who's there, you're advising you as to what to do. And often families don't do that. They just proceed.
Yeah.
I think in more recent times, you can look at the tax returns to see how they treated it.
If they filed one.
Yeah, if they filed one. Yeah, quite.
Well, the executor will have done. The executor will have filed one.
Okay, on gift tax returns, let's go back to gifts.
Yeah, sorry.
All right, so starting with if our clients are making gifts of pieces to charity. So obviously the most typical situation that comes up with giving art to charities is giving art to museums. And museums also are under financial constraint. And one of the ways that some museums are dealing with financial constraint right now is by de-accessioning certain pieces. So we have, well, I think there's, Alyssa, you were going to say a bit about the Association of Art Museum Directors and how they basically made specific accommodations to allow for more effective use of the funds from de-accessioning pieces. Do you want to say a bit about that?
Sure, absolutely. So earlier this year, I think it was in April, the Association of Art Museum Directors, or the AAMD, basically they passed a series of resolutions that allowed museums to use funds differently. So this is an organization that has oversight. There are directors from Canada, US, and Mexico, and they essentially are looking at professional practices, which do include accessioning and de-accessioning practices within museums. Historically, museums, when they sold a work or de-accessioned a work, they had to then use those funds to purchase another work of art. And given all of the difficulties that the institutions are seeing right now, they basically opened it up and passed a resolution that allowed them to use funds from trusts, donations, restricted funds essentially for operational expenses. So that was a very big change and made a lot of headlines when this happened in April. because effectively it places a moratorium until April of 2022 for any sort of punitive practices that would have occurred previously. So if that had happened before this resolution took place, then there would have been ramifications. But this is now allowing museums to find a way to use those funds. So that is just maybe worth noting.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think on that topic, so if we have clients who are particularly concerned about giving a piece to a museum and then having it subsequently deaccessioned much earlier than they were hoping or expecting, there are ways that we can try and anticipate that and head off that dispute. So one of the primary ways we would do that is just by really carefully considering the gift agreement to the museum. So I think it's probably unrealistic that any museum would agree to never deaccession a piece. It just seems like that's probably not realistic, and there are sometimes actually good reasons to deaccession a piece, but you can often negotiate certain time limits as to how long the museum must keep the piece. And then another idea that we've been considering lately that some museums are open to is that if they do choose to deaccession the piece at some point, they may negotiate a right of first refusal with the family or the family members, so that if they are in that position and they want to sell off the piece, at least the family would have the first opportunity to get it back. So Charles and Nick, are you guys seeing many museums in the UK going through a deaccession process?
No.
Or?
I mean, I don't know if you are, Nick, but I mean, the general rule in Britain is you can't deaccession from a museum once it's gone in. If it's a state museum, you can't, for whatever reason, it's there forever. And one of the problems that a lot of museums in Britain have is that probably they have 10%, like an iceberg, on display, and the rest no one ever sees, which is a sad thing. I guess one thing about giving art generally, whether it's Britain or America, is if you give and you may not give if you think the museum is going to sell for whatever reason later, and it may end up in the long term counting against you. I don't know what you've been finding about that, Nick. I mean, have you found anyone in London that's been selling from a museum? No. I mean, I don't think...
the only thing that's sort of, I guess, analogous is are those sales we talked about in the context of corporate disposals, right? The Royal Opera House and the Royal Academy is, I think, thinking of selling a large piece, aren't they, right now?
Well, I don't know how they're doing that. I mean, the Royal Opera House, I think, is a private company, so they can do what they like. But I think if you're a state museum, if you're, because they're all funded by the state, so they don't have the same financial problems as American museums, which are basically privately funded, I think, as far as I understand. You can't deaccession. You're stuck with everything. And that
I don't know the detail on what's happening with the Royal Academy, though. I know there's been talk about it. I'm not sure if a decision's been made. It's a very valuable piece. I think you're talking about £100 million piece.
Gosh, a Hockney. I think.
Yeah, well, no. The Hockney that's the Royal Opera House. It's something else. It's
the Royal Opera House. Yeah.
Yeah, the RA piece is hugely valuable, though.
Yeah.
Oh yes, no, that's a stone. That's a sculpture. Yeah.
And I do think I think this is likely to continue to be an issue even after financial recovery, because some of the reasons that the US museums at least are deaccessioning pieces don't necessarily have to do with just financial constraint. Like I know the Baltimore Museum of Art is deaccessioning some of its pieces somewhat because of financial constraint and wanting to increase salaries for some of their underpaid staff, but then also because they have a vision that they want to change the culture and the inclusion of the museum and get newer artists or artists of color or change who's represented in the museum. So I think this is going to continue to be an issue that our clients need to consider, financial crisis or no.
Do you have a sense of who's buying these things? I mean, is it private purchasers or is it other
Rebecca.
galleries?
It's likely to be
helping with the Baltimore Museum art deaccession. So if you want to touch on that, that'd be great.
Sure. We're selling 3 works from the Baltimore Museum, which, as Kristen says, is focused on sort of 2 purposes, one of which is increasing its endowment and also repositioning. And after reevaluating their collection, have really come to the conclusion they want to focus more on inclusion of artists as they structure their collection in the future. So it's expected to generate about $65 million total in sales. 2 of the works, of Bryce Martin and Still, are to be sold publicly, and then a major Andy Warhol be sold privately. But yes, generally speaking, I think these museums now are under pressures, but I think pulling it back one step even before, great planning, as you say, Kristen, can be very effective here, and carving out sort of restrictions some museums, most museums, are loath to accept highly restricted gifts. And they're going to negotiate very hard on these points with you. They don't want to be encumbered and sort of strapped with an object for perpetuity. So the thing I would add is, and it seems like it might be obvious to most folks, but it seems like it's never occurred to a lot of the collectors I've worked with. It's possible that the museum that you contemplate or vision your works going to may not want those works. It may be redundant with their collection. It may be not where they're interested in focused and heading with their collection. So I think more than ever, it is important to engage your clients at the step one, the true step one of this process, which is have lifetime conversations with the institutions, see whether or not these are objects that fit within their collection. And if it's maybe not the Met that wants this object, is a good example here in New York with the Guggenheim or other sort of blue chip institutions, there are many small museums that would love to have an object such as this and would be happy to promise to showcase it in perpetuity and provide a dedicated exhibition space for it. And lots of promises you would never get probably going to one of the major institutions. So at Sotheby's, I can say we have a museum services department, which focuses on this sort of matchmaking between collectors, their objects, and the institutions that will be the best long-term home for them. So again, if you're thinking about planning and you want to be most constructive from the outset, don't just write, I'm leaving this to the Met in my will. Definitely talk to them first.
Right.
I would definitely agree with that.
Yeah. All right, so keeping things moving so we don't anger Nicole.
Is it time? Are you, so we can move on to acquisition?
Well, actually, so I was going to move on to gifting to non-charitable recipients.
Okay.
So just we'll touch on this briefly, but especially in the US right now, I think everyone is very aware of the fact that we are in the midst of an election season, and depending on the results of this election, it could have very significant implications for our tax code. And one thing in particular that our private clients are concerned about is that the gift tax exemption could be significantly increased as soon as January 1, perhaps even sooner, but I think the consensus is usually January 1 is hopefully the earliest to give us time to plan. So one thing just to keep in mind as clients are kind of scrambling to figure out what assets they can give to make use of their $23 million exemption before January 1, some of them are considering art, which is sometimes perfectly appropriate, but just when our clients are considering making gifts of art, one thing that is very important to keep in mind is if you're giving the art or a collection to multiple recipients, it's very important to think through how is that going to work. So if it's one piece, that's even trickier, because if it's one piece, where is this piece actually going to live? How long is it going to be on this recipient's wall? How long is it going to be on another recipient's wall? How are they going to decide when and how they want to dispose of it? So these are things that, to save your descendants a lot of headaches and potentially litigation, that need to be thought through ahead of time. So I know Rebecca and I had talked about how it's important to work in consultation with an expert so that the expert can really fully inform the donor of what the issues are going to be so that they can be thought through and anticipated. And then often some sort of written agreement to make it absolutely clear, like a tenants in common agreement to really outline how they're going to manage this co-ownership is a good idea to avoid disputes down the road. I think that
Actually, I wanted to say something quickly on that, just because I had some experience with what happened when you failed to do that. When you have a sort of a joint interest in a collection, and how that can have unusual results for the donor. And we had a real paucity of litigation on this, but there is a provision in the Law of Property Act 1925. If you can get together a moiety, which means at least half of the holders, they can make petition to the court for whatever relief. And there's a very broad clause in terms of what the court can do. It's really whatever the court sees as just in terms of dealing with the future of the collection. And in that instance, the court ordered that the collection, each of the owners, each of the 1/4 owners was entitled to take one piece, each in a turn. So they'd walk into the collection, they'd say, well, this one's mine, and they'd walk off with that one. And the next person came in. There's some case law where if you, even if you assemble your moiety, if what you're seeing as doing is destructive of the proposed pieces, that will void the application. But as long as you can say you're going to hold the pieces or you're going to preserve them in some way, though I don't think it prohibits sale, you can make application to court for relief.
Yeah, and it seems like in that kind of situation, Nick, that it would be really wise to seek court approval, because if you try and do that outside of court just with a settlement agreement, it just seems like there's so many potential problems that you could face. Like if one person's really surprised by a subsequent sale where they didn't realize it was worth that much, or other issues that could come up. So it seems like the court supervised
process is a good one. Get an order for it. Get an order. Yeah. Especially actually given the positive cases as well. It makes tons of sense.
Right.
Anyway, enough on that.
What's sad with that situation is if you break up a collection and you find they're all worth a lot less once they're all in bits or parts. And there's, I suppose when you have a group like that, that's what's going to happen, unless they agree to sell the whole thing as a group.
Well, and that's why there's such broad relief, right? I mean, the court can order a whole range of relief, and one option would be to say, I'm going to force a sale. If you guys can't agree on what you're doing, I'm going to force a sale, because this can't go on and these people's their wealth is caught up in this collection they can't access.
And one of the tough things is that courts don't really know very much about the art world, and you're asking them to make art decisions, which is really difficult.
No. Well, they need expert advice, don't they?
Yeah, they do.
All right, so I think with that, we can move on to acquisition of art and antiquities. So Nick, do you want to?
Sure, I mean, these are more perennial. I think we found they were more perennial topics, but I think to the extent that there's something that's happening in the market that'd be interesting. The first one we sort of flagged up was provenance issues. And I think the most recent sort of provenance thing I'd seen was really changing provenance and what a problem that can pose. And I wonder to what extent any of you would like to comment on the fact that provenance, good provenance one day can be bad provenance down the road, particularly, I think, in modern times, but I may be wrong. Do you want to say anything about that, Charles?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I suppose we've worked on something where that happened. And I mean, the obvious one to point out is you have a very well respected dealer who often started perhaps or been parallel with their dealing life. They're also a collector. And that person perhaps, and in this case was involved in antiquities. And this person was not nearly as bona fide as he should have been. And it wasn't until towards the end of his life, I think he's now died, if this person's attachment to a number of important antiquities now calls into question what used to be good provenance, and that is simply someone's bad behavior coming out. And the art world, I'm afraid, is full of people who have done things which perhaps they shouldn't have done, or perhaps have cut corners. And you find galleries who once had great reputations get exposed, and suddenly you have an object which is brought down to some extent by that association.
Do you, Rebecca or Alyssa, do you guys have any experience of sort of changing provenance in respect to some of the things that you've seen?
I can comment on personal experience with works by Modigliani, where I think there's plenty of press. You could spend the rest of the afternoon reading about the ongoing debate and struggle between Mark Restolini and the Wildenstein-Plattner Institute, which is ongoing. But in short, it is such a dramatic and high stakes game that there are death threats being lobbed at various experts here in an attempt to silence their opinions. So it is a ever-changing landscape for us that we as experts have to stay very diligent and on top of. I would say the most important practical tip I would give to the audience is, whatever you do, preserve every single document you possibly can as it relates to the circumstances of where and when and from whom you purchased a work of art. And it means having, again, lifetime conversations with clients before their death. So these experiences can be preserved, and ones that were experienced firsthand can be written and remembered for the purposes of research. Very helpful to us ultimately. Any images of a work dating back 60 years in someone's residence, that can be useful. So again, document preservation is paramount in this exercise. Just to comment on why authentication is so important, I mean, it's very different landscape here in the US versus in Europe. And before an artwork is sold anywhere as being by a particular artist, it must be reviewed in many instances by an official authentication committee, or really a scholar who's considered to be the ultimate arbiter of that artist's work. And in Europe, thankfully, this is a pretty straightforward process because the right of droit moral or moral rights is held often by the artist or the artist's estate. It's an incredibly powerful right, and in fact, determinations of these authentication committees can't even be challenged. And just as an example, Succession Picasso is probably one of the most well-known ones. In order for a work for Picasso to be sold at auction with Alyssa, with myself, we have to obtain an official certificate from the Succession Picasso to sell it, which is Picasso's estate. It's run by his family members, his children. Again, a lot of reading can be done there about their family disputes. So if it doesn't have a certificate from Succession, we simply cannot sell it. Contrasting that with the United States, unfortunately, the US doesn't have a comprehensive legal scheme when it comes to the protection of artist rights. And the closest thing we have is the Visual Artists' Rights Act. It applies to only works created after 1991, so it's extremely limited in scope. And it doesn't provide any protection to those folks who are actually authenticating works on behalf of an artist or an artist's estate. So, we can talk about sort of the litigation that has ensued from that climate and what problems it's caused for all the major auction houses and collectors alike.
Alyssa, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Oh, Charles, did you want to say something?
Sorry, yeah.
No, I was just going to say the Warhol Foundation, which is on our list. One of the great problems is that they're so concerned about litigation now from having to authenticate that they won't, and that means you can't authenticate now an unknown Warhol work, which is extraordinary.
Yeah. The facts of that case are really outrageous and egregious. One of the probably worst examples to point to, but just to talk through them quickly, if it's useful for the audience, I think. Joe Simon Whelan is a collector who purchased Andy Warhol work back in 1989, paid about $150,000 for it. He, after 17 years of owning it, decided to sell the work. And as part of that, he needed to bring it to the Andy Warhol Authentication Board for review. He, at the time, entered into a submission agreement with the board, which basically gave the board the right to accept or deny the authorship of the work. And also, if they denied it, stamp the back of it. So in this instance, he submitted all of his documentation and the work for review. The board determined the work was inauthentic. They stamped denied in very large letters across the back of the painting. Obviously, this has a very damaging impact on the value. It ruined pretty much any possibility that it would ever be accepted and rendered it virtually worthless. So after its denial, Simon Whelan actually doubled back, got more provenance documentation, provided pretty much meticulous background on the painting's provenance. He resubmitted it for review, hoping to persuade the board this time around. They stamped denied on it again. Case double denied. So in 2007, he ultimately filed a lawsuit for antitrust against the Warhol Foundation. And this is really the nefarious part of it. He alleged artificial reduction in the number of authenticated works on the market by Warhol. And they were attempting essentially to monopolize, in his argument, the market for resale of works by Warhol. It's interesting because the Warhol Foundation has a trove of Warhols they're sitting on, basically, and he alleges they were trying to control that market. So long story short, litigation continues for a number of years, and millions of dollars are spent between both sides, over $7 million spent by the Warhol Foundation in legal fees. Ultimately, it was settled, but it was really a Pyrrhic victory, since the foundation was forced to put their authentication board out of business, so to speak. So a lot of other major foundations have followed suit in the US, including Pollock, Herring, Basquiat, huge names that fetch huge prices at auction. So it leaves collectors who don't have any provenance essentially up a creek. And I think this is really the issue. It's been a hugely chilling effect because of these legal costs, and just no one is willing to fight them or put their name on the line as an expert to authenticate a work in the absence of really direct evidence that it's in a catalog raisonné or otherwise documented.
Okay, we're running short on time, and we have two other topics we want to discuss.
I think we can hit on. I think it might be important to talk in this context about destruction as well, because that's quite controversial in terms of the authentication process. And then I think we do that, and then we talk very, very briefly about the anti-money laundering directive, just because I do have to hit that. But I think if we just talk a little bit about destruction, that'd be good as well, because that's hugely controversial over here. There's a requirement under the EU directive on the enforcement of intellectual property that there be proportionality in terms of the response, and there's an argument to be made that the destruction of the art is not proportional to the intellectual property right being protected. There's also arguments over here about the conflict of interest between the authenticating house, which increases the value of its own holdings in terms of the decisions it makes. So I wonder if you guys have anything you'd like to comment on that. I think, Alyssa, you didn't get a chance to comment last time. Do you want to say something?
Sure. When we are having works authenticated overseas or with any specific group, we do have several disclosures that we have to pass along to the client. So it is typically known in advance. So if you are working with one of those foundations or committees, that basically lets you know if the work is deemed to be fraudulent or a fake, that they would destroy the work and you do not receive that work back. Some clients say, if it's not right, I'll just take it back and I'll hang it on my wall. I just, want to know. And so it is something that has to be disclosed to clients if they are wanting to go through that process. If there is any doubt and they want to keep that work, then they have to make that decision in advance. So it is something that happens on a daily basis when we are working with clients. And if there is one of those committees that destroys the works, that has to be, conveyed to the client.
Also, Rebecca, is there something you guys would like to add on that, or?
I mean, that really encapsulates it. There is a sort of a concern for any collector who has work that, when submitted for review by an authentication committee, that it may be destroyed. I mean, this involves major artist names like Marc Chagall, Juan Monroe. So it's just something that you want to be entirely aware of before you go down that road, in the event you have any concerns.
I was Nick, that my feeling is that what we're coming into is something which is very perhaps particular to the art world, which is vested interests. And these arise in all over the place in the art world. And where you have an authenticating group that also is a dealer or has a holding of their own, it is so dangerous. And to destroy a work of art where a decision is very often, particularly if it's an old work of art, it's a subjective decision. And I was thinking about the Rembrandt Research Project, which is obviously dealing with an old master, where about 200 Rembrandts were cut out when the project came together. And they said, these are no longer accepted as Rembrandts. And if they destroyed them, well, obviously a disaster, because many of those works have now come back and have been accepted again. And that is terrible when you think about it, that a short-term decision can be made like that. But I think what both Rebecca and Alyssa are saying is right. I think you have to be really, really clear if you're going to go to an authentication group that you have made the best case you possibly can, because once they've made their decision and put, as you say, Rebecca, denied on the back, it's almost impossible. You're calling into question their judgment by approaching them again, because you put them in a corner. They can't say, actually, no, we were wrong, because then people won't believe them anymore. It's really difficult. So be very careful and know exactly who you're approaching, and be very confident if you're going to do it in what you have.
Have any of the three of our guest speakers, have you guys ever heard of or experienced people pursuing damages against these authentication organizations?
Not particularly in the US, I can't say we've experienced it. I mean, certainly there have been suits similar to those which you saw with the Warhol Foundation. I know the Calder Foundation has also sustained substantial legal costs associated with defending their issuing of A numbers. So, but no, beyond that.
Was it Rebecca? Sorry, Alyssa, please speak, sorry.
Sure. Just one of the issues that goes hand in hand with that is just the insurance of works of art. So that is something that we do deal with a little bit more than maybe any sort of lawsuits along those lines. But when people are insuring works of art and they have purchased it and it turns out that it is not right, or they've inherited it and they want it appraised for, say, $5 million and later find out it's not right, there is really no recourse for that. So you've paid for many, many years oftentimes, and for security and for various issues related to the security for that work of art and for that insurance. And so that is just something to be mindful of, is knowing what you have. And so we spend a lot of time with authentication, but also just valuing objects within a client's home. And that is one of the big issues, is because oftentimes clients will find out that, you know, they had something on an insurance listing at a much more inflated number than it actually is worth. And so to prevent any of that disappointment, that's just something to be a consideration for the audience.
Yeah.
Okay, you guys we're well over, and I do have some questions. So unless you have anything more you want to add at this point, I think we should turn to questions.
And I get 2 seconds. 2 seconds to strike with the. I just want to say this. That
Bad moderator.
I know I'm terrible about this, but anyway, sorry about this. The fifth anti-money laundering directive on the 10th of January 2020 was extended to art, and that has made art dealers much more like typical financial institutions who have substantial KYC. It's all part of this broader move towards transparency. But obviously the art world and the possibility for money laundering in it has caught the attention of the authorities, and they are very, very intrigued. And I think it's part, as I say, it's part of this overall move towards greater transparency, public beneficial ownership registries for corporations, greater transparency for trusts over here. And so it is just something that is, I think, going through the art world over here right now in a big way.
Great.
Oh, sorry, off to you, Nicole. I apologize.
Ready? You ready for your first question? Okay. First question. Do art sellers have obligations to their buyers to tell them about bad provenance facts discovered post-sale?
Yeah, Nick, we had a case on this issue, and when we're talking about when I asked, have people heard of cases where you're pursuing damages against the authenticator, it seems like more often the route people go, which is similar to the case Nick and I handled, is that you pursue damages against the seller and then any experts that they use to convince you of the authenticity. So we had, in the States, there were a couple of high-profile people who are actually facing criminal charges, who were routinely fabricating provenance. So I think that's something we've definitely experienced a significant amount of.
But I think the question was, do you have an obligation as the seller to go to the purchaser and tell them about the bad provenance?
I will jump in. Yeah, we're actually in the midst of a current case with the FBI right now about an art forgery ring. There was a work of art that was presented to us a couple years ago, and the party that brought it to us provided very extensive background and had a great story, but it was basically an unknown George Alt. And essentially what happened, we showed it to all of, several dealers, museums, a whole group that gave it their blessing, and we moved forward with the sale, later to find out that one of the paints that was used was not available at the time that the paint, that the work had been, that they said it was completed. So we did go back to the buyer, and it was basically our obligation. When you purchase at auction, there are a lot of disclosures that you're purchasing as is, but obviously if you're working with major auction houses, they are going to make things right. So we did go back to the buyer, and we're now working with the FBI, and there's a current case going on right now. So we do hope to get some compensation from the other side, but that is definitely a big question.
Yeah.
There's a bit of an issue here, I suppose, because the part of this money laundering directive is that you have an obligation to file suspicious activity reports where you're concerned that crime has been committed is not fanciful. And so the art house itself the dealer is going to have to report to the authorities what's happened. I suppose it depends on the detail of what you're talking about, but if they suspect there's been criminal activity of some kind, they have an obligation to report it. They also have a problem because they can't tip off. So if they have a concern that the seller may be somehow implicated in what's happened, they may be committing a criminal act by telling them. So there are that is a really fact-specific inquiry, frankly.
Right. Yeah, I think it definitely heavily depends on the particular facts and circumstances. But I think in the States, at least, I mean, there are potential just fraudulent misrepresentation claims that you could bring against the seller depending on the circumstances. If they truly had actual knowledge that this was a fake and they were misrepresenting that to a potential buyer, then there is potential liability for misrepresenting that in that way.
To jump on that point, Kristen, I mean, there's the probably most notable instance of this happening in the US, which is the Knoedler Gallery case, in which the gallery itself was very much involved, participatory in the manufacture of fakes and forgeries of very well-known abstract expressionist artists, and sold for hundreds of millions of dollars over the course of years, all with sort of fabricated provenance. And, you know, it reinforces the position that we always take. Again, due diligence and research is so important, but in this instance, it was sort of it sounds too good to be true, it may be. And the background story for these works were, they were completely rediscovered works coming from a reclusive collector in South America who is remaining unnamed. So as a buyer in those circumstances, you certainly should begin to, your ears should begin to perk up a bit when you begin to hear facts like that as the background and the provenance, and without any other further substantiation or support from catalog raisonné or experts.
Right.
I mean, you really want a work of art if you can get it that has literature and exhibition history, something you can check, you know, because otherwise, if you as a buyer, you know, caveat emptor is it's on you to find out. You're really buying it blind. You know, and if someone is behaving badly and you don't have an agent for the seller, like an auction house or someone like me as an agent for the seller, there's no one doing any form of due diligence on the seller. And that I'm afraid, I'm not sure what the law is in America, but I imagine it's caveat emptor. I imagine the pressure is put on the buyer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hey, do we have time for another one?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. The person has asked, I understand that initially due to COVID, there was a strain on the art handler market, which caused delivery delays and increased pricing. Has this dislocation abated over time?
And I can speak to recent shipping quotes as recent as those I received this morning for returns of works that are being viewed by experts in Paris in advance of our major fall sales of Impressionist and modern works of art. They are still somewhat elevated, although we're seeing the price come down a bit, not to pre-pandemic levels. But, you know, in the peak of the pandemic, the shuttles that regularly ran, say, along the eastern seaboard were no longer operating. It was increasingly difficult to relocate works that were spread throughout the world. However, that said, around our major auctions, we were still able to get very important works to the collectors that needed to see them in advance of sale. But that said, if anybody has questions about shipping, obviously all folks in the call have, I'm sure, a long list of resources they can recommend for international transport. And again, using the most professional art handlers and shippers is of the utmost importance when you're transporting works.
Yep.
Don't try to just put on your private plane or in the back of the car if you can't get an art handler to do it.
Okay. And then I have one last question. With the proliferation of online auction sales, has the requirement changed in any way for the consignor to send the material into the auction house before the auction?
We still have the property arrives on site. We have 5 different sales rooms around the country. So sometimes it will be sold out of Palm Beach or Denver or one of our other locations. So we do try to minimize that. And oftentimes we will just post sales that list where the property is going to be shipped from. So we are looking to try to help with logistics, and shipping is a big cost for people. So that is something that we do look at. But right now, most property is shipped to one of the galleries so it can be shot. And we can get those photos to everybody. Like we've talked about, all clients are looking for a lot more images. And so physically seeing it is not as important right now to many clients, but as long as they could get really great documentation and images, that typically helps move the sale forward.
Great. Thank you. Okay, we are right at time. So do you have anything more you want to add? Anything
I'd just like to thank all of you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you all. It was
Yes,
brilliant.
absolutely.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Yes, thank you, Alyssa, Rebecca, and Charles for being here. And thank you to everyone viewing for joining us today. Upon leaving our program, you're going to be directed automatically to our event evaluation. So if you could complete that, we would appreciate it. We really do value your feedback and appreciate your comments so that we can continue to improve our programming. So thank you very much, and we will see you next time.